everyone, and welcome back to ConTinual series of interviews with winners of the Manly Wade Wellman Award for North Carolina Science Fiction and Fantasy. The award is presented by the North Carolina Speculative Fiction Foundation. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott, and my guest today is Natania Barron, the 2021 winner for Queen of None, a new take on the Arthurian legends. Natania's first novel, Pilgrim of the Sky, was published in 2011 and was reissued by Falstaff Books this year. Since 2011, she has published multiple novellas and numerous short stories, along with two other novels, including Queen of None. She has two more novels scheduled for release late this year and early in 2023. Natania is not only a writer, but a mental health advocate, especially with regard to adolescent care. She has drawn national attention for her writing, including mainstream news and television appearances. On top of all that, she shares regular posts on Twitter and on her blog about fashion history. Welcome, Natania.
Thank you so much for having me, Nancy.
It's great to have you, and belated congratulations on your win.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Please tell us about Queen of None.
Wow, yeah, Queen of None, was one of those books that came kind of fast and furious. We're actually just about in November. So it was a NaNoWriMo book. So it was a National Novel Writing Month book, which quite a few of my books actually are. I love NaNoWriMo. A lot of people have mixed feelings about it, but it's always good. I compete against myself. I don't really use it to compete against other people. It's just great to get in the habit of writing daily. It kind of helps get me into the mood as we get into the darker winter months, which tends to be the most productive time of year for me when it comes to writing anyway. But I often call it the thesis that I didn't get to write in graduate school. My academic career ended after my master's degree, mostly because academia just didn't seem a good fit for me anymore. I really wasn't interested in the pedagogical side anymore. I wanted to be a researcher. I wanted to be in the library with old books. I was far more excited about finding, old Middle English romances that no one had studied than I was necessarily teaching, undergrads, English 101 that they really didn't care about. And that was kind of a big realization for me and rather heartbreaking because that was kind of what I had my mind so intent on for so many years. And then very abruptly, pretty much after I had my son, I had a wonderful interview at UNC actually, talking to the head of the English department about my research. And it went wonderfully. It went so well, but I left and I walked through campus and it was this time of year. So it was just glittering autumn. And I just had this feeling in my stomach. And I said, I should feel so excited about how this went. And I'm not. I think I'm done. And of course, the debt had gone through the ceiling and all this stuff. But I had been let down in a couple of ways in my master's program. But I had been introduced to the Arthurian legend, taking quite a few courses on it. Most of my coursework and my research was in Arthuriana, particularly on the intersection of the Middle East and sort of the matter of England, as they call it. But also having been exposed to all these incredible female characters, so many of them. I mean, there are hundreds, if you probably count them if you go back far enough. Even in the Welsh triads, Arthur supposedly has 3 wives of Guinevere, which I play on in these books because I just thought what a bizarre thing to throw in there that he just happened to be married to a woman named Guinevere 3 times. And when I started to write this story, my sister was fighting cancer. She was diagnosed at 23 with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And, my dad has been ill my whole life. My mom was a breast cancer survivor, and I was dealing with a lot of trauma. And you've read the book. It has a lot of dark themes. It has a lot of even elements, I'd say, of body horror in it as well. And but really about the spaces that women can take up, even in worlds that are very, very dominated by men. And I was figuring out who I was. I would say certainly in academia 20 years ago, I guess 16, 18 years ago, there was still a lot of that continues to be. Wrestling with who I was, I think, as a mother. The relationship of Anna and her son Gowan is really funny. I kind of joke that I predicted my future. My son is now 6'3" and built just like Gowan of Oak, Orkney. he should be a linebacker. And I often look up to him as she does in the book and kind of just wonders, how did this little squalling child turn into this, and he's got, instead of bright red hair, he's got and bright red curls like Gowan does. He's got bright blonde curls. So it's kind of amusing that when I was writing this book was tiny, running around the house with his cars. So yeah, this book was really, I loved the myths. I loved my first project was about Gowan and tracing the metamorphosis of his story through the very beginnings of Welsh tales all the way through to Mallory and beyond, and how someone can start out as a hero and then over time become this terrible villain with his brothers and Mallory, and kind of murderous and underhanded. And I love this constant movement and how so many people had taken over the story. But Anna as a character was not someone I created. She actually existed and was kind of supplanted by her sisters in further stories as the Arthurian legend went to France and beyond. Morgane and Morgause and the others became more popular. And but she was a full-blooded sister of Arthur. And I always, from the moment that I read about her, years ago in undergraduate school, I said, she just has to have a cool story. And sure enough, no one had ever written that story. And I decided that was going to be the story that I wrote. And I did.
So you decided on that story instead of Gowan's story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But Queen of Fury, he features very heavily in. So definitely staying with the family for that one.
And that's the next one, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Okay. What other genres or subgenres do you write?
So I kind of like to talk about the umbrella of historical or historical inspired fiction. Fantasy, dark fantasy is where I'm most comfortable. It comes to no surprise to people who know me from Thread Talk that I love fashion and I love clothing and the history of fashion. And so I love writing worlds where that can be important, which truly is every world. I mean, you can even take it to space and make it make sense. But I'm a person who loves a little bit getting lost in the findings and buttons of things. So I particularly love writing period. And I have studied, thankfully, as an English major, you read very broadly. So I fell in love with the Romantic era, with the Regency period. I love the Victorians. So I'm pretty comfortable, moving from decade to decade. The novella series in These Marvelous Beasts moves from the Edwardian to the 20s to the 30s. The book that I still have out to publishers now is a Regency witch story. And that was really easy for me because, I fell in love with Jane Austen when I was in college, and, it was like visiting old friends. So, and then medieval for me is home. And so when I do write secondary world, I tend to focus mostly in medieval to kind of age of exploration is kind of where I sort of cut things off. So I love kind of up to sort of a Tudor-like period. I think that we don't have enough fantasy worlds still being discovered. So I do have a fantasy series that's unpublished yet, but I loved the idea of creating a world that was still being discovered by its own people. So I always find it so funny that so many sort of dark ages fantasies, like everyone knows where everyone lives and what their cultures are like. And it's like, well, maybe they don't. We certainly have had a lot of travel, but certainly not to the level that I think some folks do. But yeah, I love history. I love context. I know that I'll never be accurate as much as I'll try to be as close as I can. When I was able to revisit Pilgrim of the Sky, I was very glad to be able to go back and make some edits to things that I have learned in the last 10 years to make things a little bit more close. But again, it was, that when you write fantasy, there's always a little bit of room for wiggle room there.
Right. So when did you know for sure that you wanted to write fiction? Was it when you got the idea for Anna's book, or was it at a later or earlier point?
Writing fiction in general?
Yeah.
I have always been a fiction writer. I was in second grade writing tomes. I was such a voracious reader as a child. I don't even remember learning to read. I know that when I got to kindergarten, I could already read. And I was never bored by books without pictures. They were just, I have a very vivid imagination. Some people have issues with imagining as they're reading, but when I read, I get the whole movie experience, like I get the whole color, sound, everything. I love listening to audiobooks because it's really like watching a movie for me. And I loved reading so much that the natural progression for me was to start writing my own stories. And I moved school at that tender, difficult age of 11, in the middle of, I had just started half the year of my first year of middle school, to a school system where sixth grade was not in middle school, it was in elementary school. So I actually had to go back to elementary school, which, if you're that age, is the most tragic thing that can possibly happen to you. And I was also quite grown up for my age, both, well, in some ways, but physically, certainly. And so I looked much older than I was for my age, and I had a really hard time making new friends. And I just started really writing seriously, where it was like, instead of little stories, I would just fill up notebooks. And of course, at that time, I was just mimicking everything that I loved. And it was really when I found Stephen King that I started really writing long things. And they were terrible, and they were all Stephen King knockoffs. They were all The Stand, and they were all The Body, and they were all, I liked very much his sort of character-driven stories. But instead of going to recess and playing on the swings, I would just sit there and write in my notebooks. And college was hard because academia made a big shift in the last 30 years, where you used to be able to publish books and be a teacher and still get tenure and all that stuff. And now it's really about research and publication and journals. And it's very hard to live those two worlds. And my grandfather was a poet, but taught in an English department. And I thought that I could write books and teach in an English department. Much harder to do. So I kind of tried the very serious academic side for a while. And then it was after I had my son, and I had him pretty young, but I remember looking at him at about a year old and thinking, what if I tell him that I just gave up? I always knew I was a writer, but I didn't have the receipts. And I just said, I don't ever want him to ask me, Mom, what did you want to be? And I said, well, I wished I was a writer, but I never really worked hard enough at it. And there was something, I don't advocate for having kids, generally speaking, to help with your writing career. But it certainly gave me some perspective about who I was and who my identity was. And that was when, after having postpartum depression, I will add that I really kind of found myself through, especially speculative fiction, which was not something I had a name for, because until I discovered the North Carolina speculative fiction community, when I moved down here, I didn't know that it had a name. And a lot of what I was writing was steampunk or myth punk. It didn't really fall into fantasy or science fiction. And so it was so cool to meet people who were exploring that. And you probably know Sam Montgomery Blinn, but he was someone that I met early on, and just introduced me to phenomenal people who really helped those first few short stories find homes. And little by little, bit by bit, things happened over time.
Well, when you decided to pursue publication to get the receipts, as you put it, did you map out a plan, or did you kind of try one thing and then try another, or how did you go about pursuing that goal?
Oh, those heady days. It was really hard because I've always had to work full time. And I was a freelancer for a long time. I work in marketing. So it was really just doing my best and hoping that the right connections and the right opportunities would come along, while continuing to just, everything that I write is hopefully better than the next thing that I wrote before. And knowing that whatever I put down is the best that I could do given the circumstances that I'm in. Speaking, we talked a lot, you mentioned the, mental health advocacy. We've had a lot of mental health, crises in our family. There's just times where writing is not happening. It's gotten better as my children have gotten older, but there were a lot of years I took a big break from writing and had some really good early success, but then really burned out around 2016 or so. It took about 3 years where I really didn't do any writing. I had a big 6 nonfiction book publication that just didn't go the way that I had hoped. the industry is very hard, and my first book was good, and I enjoyed Pilgrim of the Sky and what went on there, but between everything that happened and raising my two young kids, there wasn't a lot of strategy. But it was a lot of really cool happenstance. I mean, I found my first publisher on Twitter. It was an open call. Queen of None was, I had gone to an event where I met the publisher years ago, and when they opened up the press, they were reaching out to people that they knew, and they said, do you happen to have any books? We're looking for some new titles, and we're kind of reaching out to people we know and we can vouch for our first thing. And I said, well, I had this trunk novel that I've been sitting on that I can't quite give up on because I believe it's something special. I had tried to send it out to agents. It's a very, you probably know this, but Arthurian novels are kind of hard to sell as a pitch these days, especially now. So, but that was, just through people that I knew. And so that's in like so many things in this life. You just happen to be at the right place at the right time. John Hartness, who we all know, I met him at a convention, and, we hit it off like long lost brother and sister. It was like, we share a number of mental illness diagnoses and just have, a great rapport together. And he's like, do you want to write in this shared world? And I had not written anything in a long time. I'd written a couple things for RPGs and things that were kind of, for spec, and it was kind of nice to have. I was writing, but it was very much like, here's the 5 things you need to include in this story. It was like, okay, I can do that. But that was really helpful for me to just kind of get out of this place, to show myself that I could do it again, because it is a very thankless, very lonely business, and you do have to take those breaks. So, but about a year and a half ago, I finished Netherford Hall, which is the Regency witch book. And that's when I said, I had kind of sort of gone looking for an agent quite a few times. And, the volume that you have to, I hear about people like, I sent it out to 215 agents and I have a spreadsheet tracker and all that stuff. My life and my brain are too chaotic for that. But I did use, I think it's Agent Tracker, anyway, it is a nice little platform that lets you, you subscribe to it and kind of through, but I ended up not finding my agent there. I found her through using the MSWL manuscript wishlist hashtag on Twitter, and she was said she was looking for haunted house stories and books, and Netherford Hall is about very much a building as much as it is about the characters, and so that's how I found her. So yeah, I think more than anything, trying to be open to what is out there and giving myself the grace to know that I don't have the mental capacity these days or the grit necessarily that someone who might have more time on their hands can. I've got to dedicate my time to the writing, and then hoping that in the times between, it's about being my authentic self and hoping that the right people come across my path, and that that will match someone. And so far, that has mostly worked.
So actually what I'm hearing in this is that you found your publisher for for Queen of None because you networked. You put yourself out there and you met people, and you made an effort to get to know people.
And it was local though, which is, I hear a lot, and I feel this, it's very hard. If there is a silver lining to the circumstances of the last few years, it is that there's been more access for people who can't leave, because having a special needs child has meant that most of my networking has been local. My publisher was not from North Carolina, but came to a North Carolina speculative fiction night 10 years ago. And I guess I had made a good enough impression that they reached out to me on Facebook. So I think don't despair if you feel like you can't make it to every Worldcon and World Fantasy and Hugo Award, event. It can feel difficult. I mean, I definitely have FOMO sometimes because I wish I could be there. And it's, in our case, it's not even a matter of I can't afford it. It's I can't be away from my kid. I can't if he's in a difficult time, I just can't do it. It's gotten easier, but even so, it's a bit of a gamble. And I have a great job, but my job also requires travel. So it's, it's trying to balance all of that to be the right person. But, given the digitization of things that we've seen, events like ConTinual, right? we now have the opportunity to be ourselves, but also, social media is powerful. It's not easy. I've definitely Twitter these days has been very challenging, but it does give you an opportunity to be who you are and leverage those tools to connect with people. And that's always going to be the best way. Just like every slush pile, right? And John and many other publishers talk about this. You can try the slush pile, or you can try to connect with people. And it's so much easier to look at a story and know a person and think, I could work with them through revisions, right? Than just get something through a slush pile and know nothing about that person. And maybe their cover letter comes across as standoffish. It's so easy to just say no. Yeah.
Well, going back to closer to the beginning from Queen of None, Library Journal described Pilgrim of the Sky as a science fiction adventure that mixes high action with exquisitely detailed descriptions of everyday existence in these alternate worlds. Please tell us about Pilgrim of the Sky and its path to publication.
Sure. So Pilgrim of the Sky was my attempt I guess I started about 12, 13 years ago at this point, to write something. Up until that point, I'd been writing a lot of secondary world. My first foray into kind of the digital world was through a podcast I did of one of my first books called The Aldersgate Cycle, which is a weird Western fantasy. And so I decided I would try something that was a little more mainstream. So it's got elements of romance, it's got some time travel. It starts in the modern day, right? Most of my stuff doesn't do that. And it started in the area I grew up in, Western Massachusetts. So it's a reverse Mary Sue. Most people start where they know, but I was like, this is very weird for me, but I'm going to write about the place that I'm from because that might be interesting for me to do. And I've always been fascinated with this idea of the sort of concept of the gods, right? That if you look at all these different pantheons, there just tend to be these archetypes, right? You can tell that I went through liberal arts colleges, right? Because that's what we study so often. But I wanted to create this world where it's not just about archetypes, but archetypes that are born and reborn. And so it's kind of, I often pitch it as American Gods meets Doctor Who, right? So instead of big gods, they're godlings. And so there's 8 worlds in this world, and 8 beings are born and reborn. And the power of each world and each godling kind of depends on how many of them are alive at the same time. And there's not a lot of control over how they happen or what happens. But the main character in Pilgrim of the Sky is Maddie Angler. Her name is Madeline. She's named after Madeline L'Engle because Madeline Angler. Anyway, it's a pun because one of my favorite authors ever. And it's about her kind of discovering who and what she is, but stumbling upon these godling beings who she really has a through the mirror kind of experience, and goes to a mirror version of her own world where people she knows are other versions of themselves, right? So but also knows that she's been looked at, and then she inhabits the body of her own, they're called twains, who's very villainous and terrible. And so it's not just about her discovering who she is, but kind of learning about the facets of herself and the light and the darkness and who we all are as people. And it's really, it's a love story, but it's also about the power of love and the power of the love of power very much as well. And that was a very eye-opening experience. I was pregnant when the book came out, which emotionally is a lot to deal with, being pregnant and having a book come out. But it went through the whole review experience, and mostly people enjoyed it, which is good. It's not an easy book. It wasn't intended to be a book for everybody. It's not, as mainstream as I can do. But the people who loved it really loved it, and it still means a lot to some people, and that's the best you can ever ask for. And it was great to, when I got the rights back because I wanted to do the sequel, which is more of like, and I have a habit of doing this. They're not direct sequels, but they're in the same world. You'll hear that again. Um, I wanted them to kind of be repackaged. I wanted a chance to go back and make a few changes. I had some terminologies. I had some fat phobia that was in there that I didn't even realize I had in there, because we change and we grow as people, and you go back and you go, oh gosh, what was I thinking when I wrote this? But that's part of our growth as people, and it was kind of refreshing to go back and make some of those changes. And yeah, I'm proud of the book. I'm proud of the work that it took, and that I got through that. There were some really fascinating reviewers that I still to this day have some chuckles over, when it came to the whole gauntlet of getting in front of early access readers. But yeah, it's definitely something fun. I would love eventually. My dream was to write 8 books in this series, each dedicated to one of the godlings. So spoiler, but Maddie is one of them. It's not a huge spoiler. The book's been out for 10 years, but it's I think it's an important book in my progress. Maddie is bisexual. I was not out at that time, but it's like the most obvious thing in the universe if you read the book. It's like looking out. Like, I had my own crap to deal with leading up to it, but sometimes you kind of have to put it out on paper. I wrote a post about it right before the book came out, that sometimes you kind of just need to envision that world. And I didn't want her sexuality to be the plot. Mm-hmm. This was just part of who she is. This is a facet of her own divinity, in fact. And it's important, but it's not her coming out story. It's just she had girlfriends and she's attracted to both men and women and anything in between. And it's just, that's who she is. So looking back now, 10 years later, I can see how important that was, because it wasn't much. It was only like 2 years after that where I kind of was like, I just like had to come out to my husband and came out to friends and family, and were like, I grew up fundamentally Christian, and so I had a lot to work through. But I really see this book as a real stepping stone in that growth for myself, and kind of seeing that book safely go out into the world, and like seeing that nobody freaked out and everyone was fine. My mother-in-law read the book, and people read it and loved it, and there was, the alarms didn't go off. It was like, okay, maybe I can do this.
Well, now later this year, Falstaff Books is going to release The Gods of Londinium. Mm-hmm. Now, is that a prequel, or is that the sequel you were referring to? Or so
so technically it's a prequel, but it is a connected novel. So you don't have to have read Pilgrim of the Sky to read Gods of Londinium. I was able to add a bridge scene at the end of the re-release version of Pilgrim of the Sky, where Joss Raddick, who is the godling of the sea, so he's kind of a cross between Poseidon and The Witcher, if you kind of, with a sarcastic tilt to him. And he is like Maddie's best friend. I mean, they are just this beautiful, platonic, amazing friendship. And he basically grants her access to his memories of his life, how he becomes who he is. And so that's kind of where the story, so Gods of Londinium is told in first person, which is very different from Pilgrim of the Sky, and it is his coming of age. So it's really from him being born as a full-fledged adult godling through his whole life in what's called Second World, which is sort of the premise of that world is that the Romans never left Britain. So it's and sort of technology has not advanced as far. So it's sort of, even though contemporaneous with our time, it's more sort of like an advanced steampunk era. But the time period that this happens in is sort of a romantic period. So the romantic poets are there. There's some nice, some cameos. But it's really, it's a love story. It's a love story between two of the godlings in particular. And if you read the first book, you'll recognize the archetypes from the first book. But it really explains some of the stuff that happens in the first book, as well as sort of the intensity and sort of the, one of the things I thought a lot about was, if you're a creature that lives this long, because that's the only way that godlings can really die is they kind of fade away, or they just decide to go, right? They are immortal. A a lot of them go mad, right? A lot of them deal with so much heartbreak and loss over so much time. And they have each other, and if they're lucky, they might lose someone and they're reborn again and they can find them, but they really have each other to lean on. So that was another story that was that was written in a period of grief. I lost my sister's best friend, passed away in 2013, and he was like a little brother to me. And then my great aunt passed away shortly after, who was my best friend, even though she was in her 80s. And this book is very much about grief. It's about, even though these creatures are immortal, sometimes hanging on is too painful. Sometimes you can still be wounded if you're an immortal in this world. And sometimes pain is too much. Sometimes the good thing is to love someone and let them go. It's a big book. It's very different from the other stuff that I've written. It's a bit more melancholy and somber, and there's moments of humor and romance and lots of adventure on the high seas. So, ship fights and wars and, lots of they can shape shift these godlings. So there's kind of that kind of fun kind of magic and crime fighting. One of the things that they do to keep themselves occupied is they fight in the streets of Londinium to keep crime away, because as you do. But yeah, Joss's story was very, very dear to me. And I knew the minute that he showed up on the page in the first book that he was going to be the first one that I was going to tell the story. And I wanted to do this sort of Bildungsroman to throw out that, English majory world, where to start him when he's just sort of this larva, right? What is it like to be born a godling and have this amazing power, and to be taken under the wing of, other godlings who are sort of these, just larger than life people, and get into lots of trouble, which is basically the premise of the book. They continually get into tons of trouble. And then, of course, have their own interpersonal trouble as well.
And so you said you wanted to originally write, I think it was 8 books.
Mm-hmm. There's 8 godlings. Yeah.
Okay. Switching gears, kind of, you've written one rock and roll novel, Rock Revival, which was published in 2018. Why did you decide to dive into the music world?
So, music has always been part of my life. I've been playing guitar since I was 11 or 12. My dad is an accomplished guitarist and musician. My parents actually waited 10 years to have kids. They spent 10 years trying to make it in music in the 70s. So my whole life, I've been surrounded by incredible music. I grew up in recording studios. My dad let my sister and I, just record whatever we wanted. We put an album down when we were in high school. I still sing with my sister all the time. And I love music. I love classic music, but classic rock and classical music, but I also love pop music. My kids know they can come to me anytime they want to listen to Taylor Swift and Carly Rae Jepsen, and I have a deep abiding love for pop music. But I also love Britpop, and a lot of this book was inspired by Fleetwood Mac and the band dynamics that you see, and sort of the music that I was listening to in college, and when my son was born, that kind of era of sort of resurgence of English rock music. You had Coldplay, and you had Keane, and you had a lot of these other groups that came through. And I had this character, Kate Stix, who, I love this idea of kind of coming in to the story as the band was falling apart, instead of, because so often it's all about the glitz and the glamour and the sort of the rush of everything, but kind of knowing that things are falling apart and those kinds of dynamics. And that was another kind of Fast and Furious book, and I really, really enjoyed it. I tried to query it around, and again, it was one of those stories that it's a hard sell. Music books are really, really hard to get people excited about. Of course, right afterwards, Daisy and the Sixth came out, which I thought was really funny. But there's always something. But yeah, I'm proud of that book too. And I the people that it's connected to with, it's my husband's favorite book of everything that I've ever written, and I think it's a pretty accurate portrayal without being as kind of glamorized as a lot of rock stories are. So I've read a lot in the genre, and the whole time I'm kind of going, I don't think they've ever been in a studio before. I don't think that's not exactly how guitar works, or it's all very romanticized and kind of there's a lot of rock romance books, and this isn't really a romance book. I mean, there's kind of some hookups and there's a little bit of romance, but it's really more about Kate's journey, as a musician and finding her own voice and sort of being this. She's a songwriter and a keyboard player, but it's someone else singing her songs in the band, and she's kind of a backup singer and a keyboardist. So she's the moneymaker, but she's not the face. Right. And throughout the story, she kind of becomes, she finds her own story and her own voice, and it's not a dramatic, there are things getting thrown against the wall kind of end, but I think that's how a lot of bands, kind of drift apart. So yeah, I think I'd love eventually to do more in that kind of world in the future at some point too.
Well, in 2020, Falstaff Books released a collected edition of your Frost and Filigree novellas. What's that series about and what inspired it?
Sure. So this was the series that John invited me to be part of. And he said, I'm doing these, the archive series from the John Harkness books, and basically you can just pick whatever time period you want and run with it. And as long as it doesn't mess with the lore, you can do whatever you want. You can have fun. And within a day or two, I had this idea of creating, and I've always loved this, monster heroes, right? Sort of female driven monster stories where the monsters are actually the heroes and kind of working under the radar, fixing all the things that the humans are messing up. And it features a sylph and a lamia. So a sylph is sort of a, for lack of a better term, kind of like a siren kind of creature. And then a lamia is a snake woman. They both can glamour themselves, look very much like humans, and they're kind of a sorted group of friends that very found family kind of story. The lamia is hopelessly in love with the sylph who doesn't, the very unrequited love story. And they go through 3 decades of adventures. So each novella takes place in a different decade, but it's all interwoven stories, very character driven, very witty, kind of almost Downton Abbey kind of tone, where it's lots of quips and lots of back and forth conversation. There's a dwarf who can shed limbs to get out of bad situations. There's a unicorn. There's a questing beast. So it's meant to be, fun and adventurous, a little bit in the vein of the Mummy kind of movies, which I absolutely adore as well. And it was really a great way for me to write my way back into having fun again with the writing that I've done. And so those 3 novellas came out, and as the whole in These Marvelous Beasts, it was a lot of people found their way to me for the first time actually through that larger piece, and that was pretty exciting to do that. And then lots of fashion, of course, not for the first time, but Vivian is a fashion designer, so I've had a couple of fashion designer characters, and I'm not mad about that. Sorry, not sorry. But she likes to design clothing for monsters, because if you are glamored, you still have to take into consideration some of the body functions that are underneath the glamours, of course.
Of course. Well, as we're recording this, you've published close to 24 short stories. Do any of these tie into your longer works?
A few. I have. Well, it's kind of funny. I mentioned my first novel that I podcasted, which was the Aldersgate Cycle. I actually have a short story called Pushing Paper in Hartley that was in the Subversion anthology that Cross Genres did a few years ago. So it's the only truly published piece of that world that exists, because the other piece was just a podcast that was sort of a draft of a novel that never really went anywhere. But that actually has a Sir Gawen, who is another proto-Gawain of another world in it, which is kind of funny. But it's that character who is a knight in a Weird West world, who is basically forced to push paper instead of be out on horseback, and kind of deciding to stop that. So that was always really fun that I was able to do that. But most of my short fiction is not. Most of my short fiction is much darker, weirder, stranger, definitely verging more on horror. And I just tend to be creepier when I'm in short form, because more distilled down, and it's a good way for me to keep myself a little bit more focused. I think when I tend to think in long, big character arcs, I tend to write novels. So horror helps me kind of keep things to those beats a little bit better. And I think it just tends to work in the long run a little bit more easy. I've done a lot of tie-in work as well for various RPG games. I've had stuff that I can't put on the list here for tie-ins that I've done for IPs, for video games and things like that have been super fun to do as well. And I love doing that kind of work. It's super, super cool when I played a video game and someone's like, hey, could you do some dialogue writing or something like this for this game that we're doing, or this, tie-in thing that we're doing. And that's always super cool too.
Yeah. That kind of leads into my next question, which is, what do you see as the benefits and the challenges of writing short fiction?
Oh, short fiction is hard because, first of all, there's a huge amount of competition, right? So I read Slush for a long time, so I was there in the trenches, reading story after story, and you get to a point where you can just read 2 sentences and you're like, this isn't for me. And even with small magazines, you're getting sometimes hundreds of submissions every couple of days. So, it does teach you, I think, on the good side, to build that thick skin. That's certainly come in so much handy in my day job. I think everyone should learn to do writing and submit submissions and get feedback, or not, right? Put it into the void. But I would say that short fiction is probably just not where my heart is. I tend to think in long character arcs, and characters are what drive me to write. And I struggle to come up with short stories because I want the character experience. And I know there are phenomenal folks out there that I will read everything that they put in short fiction. John Wiswell is a great person like that, where they can just distill everything so perfectly in that short form and make you fall in love with that character and have that character arc and just walk away crying and laughing and just in a whole other experience. And I kind of want to leave it to those folks, because I always feel like my short stories are more of a glimpse into something than they are where my heart is. And I a few years ago, after, going again through another, I had a short story that I thought was great, that I thought, oh man, it's for sure I'm going to place this somewhere. This is going to be an Asimov's. This is going to be an Apex. This is going to be somewhere exciting. Nobody wanted it. No real clear feedback. And I said, I'd rather spend my time focusing on the novels, which generally also pay sort of better, and just are closer to where my heart is. And I think that as we mature as writers, you start asking yourself those questions, especially for some of us who have super limited time, where maybe my writing time a day might be 15 minutes, right? It might be 2 hours if I'm super lucky, if I get up early, or if I have it still going at the end of the day. But is my time best served? I think that's something that I've been thinking a lot about after I turned 40. I had this sort of is what I'm doing serving my time the best, right? I think about this in terms of I don't like big conventions. And it was really hard for me to kind of say, it's okay for my friends to enjoy it, and it's okay for them to miss me there, but it does not build me up or make me feel better. It actually takes too much out of me. I'd rather meet with them at the smaller conventions where I have place to escape and feel more comfortable. They might not be able to tell I can play a good game, but ultimately it's too much of a drain on me. And I think it's kind of a similar thing with the short stories, that I've got a good backlist of them, but generally speaking, it's not the best use of my energy and time.
Well, so even though you think in longer arcs and more novel type stories, what's the challenge to writing and finishing a novel?
I think what has been hardest for me the last year, because I had like 2 or 3 really good years where it was easy, it just felt easy, and I was in a good place, and I had a good thing going on. And then we had even through the challenges of the last couple of years, people were struggling to write, and I was writing like crazy. And then this last year has been has been a real struggle for me. And it's not that I haven't been putting out the words, I haven't been finishing stuff. And I heard CL Polk talk about this on Twitter the other day, and they were spot on. They also have ADHD like I do. And I'd never heard someone explain the story, the process, and it's exactly like this for me. So I have to hit a point in my novel writing where I'm living the story. And sometimes that can happen at 10,000 words. But lately it hasn't been happening for a long time. And when I am in that story, it consumes me. I'm not kidding. Like it is everywhere all at once. I make playlists. It becomes this hyper focus that I live and breathe that story. And when I can get that space going, it is a sort of superhuman power. I'm making connections and sort of editing and writing. And sometimes I have an outline, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I know the broad strokes, sometimes it's surprising me. I'll lay in bed at night and be making all these incredible connections in my head and writing it down. It's like I can't channel it fast enough. But this last year, I've been getting 30, 40, 50,000 words in, and I still feel like I'm just slogging through, and I'm not hitting that world. I haven't hit that vein, and that's been hard. Especially because for Queen of Fury, I just had it was like a freaking religious experience. And it was the same way with Netherford Hall. I had these two books back to back where it really was just me and the writing and these characters, and they changed me and I grew as a writer. And now I have these two other books that are just like, like they're like the stepsisters at this point. We're just like, okay, yeah, I've written almost 100,000 words this year, but I'm not there yet. And, I'm trying to be patient with myself. And what I try to do is just give myself grace and know that we go through periods of time and we go through periods of change. And, our brains are not meant to go 100 miles an hour all the time. And as much as people like to say that ADHD is a superpower, it's not. It's super not dependable. It's like having a turbo button that only works 1 in 15 times that you push it, and it's never when you actually want it to work. So that is a huge challenge to work around. But I don't beat myself up about it anymore, because that doesn't work. It's just detrimental to everything. So I try to surround myself. I try to read as much as possible. I've been getting a lot of nonfiction books, like this super exciting book that I just got, which is called Femina, which is a new history of the Middle Ages through the women written out of it. I mean, come on, just so excited to read this book. So, keeping it by my bedside, dorky things like buying more rocks. It's just like the dorkiest thing ever. But I love fidgets, and my favorite fidgets are minerals and rocks, and they feel cool and soft on my hands. And I just bought a whole bunch of tumbled rocks because I'm an adult and I can do this now. And I have some clean little sensory bin for myself over here, and just like trying to, I don't know, take care of myself the way I would for someone that I love, instead of beating myself up for the things that aren't happening. And it'll get there. And I already feel like it's coming back. And so much of it is just about acknowledging, and really it's burnout, right? That's what it is. Like, let's just call it spade a spade. But the first step in sort of recovering from that is just being able to say, hey, I'm tapped out, and it's okay. This happens to people. But you can't get back from that if you don't recognize where you are, and then start to be kind to yourself and build those boundaries back up, both from yourself and from those around you. Because, as I'm very fond of saying to other people when they're asking for advice, if you don't build your boundaries, other people will define them for you.
Yeah. Well, now, when you mentioned back-to-back books, and one of the ones you mentioned was Queen of Fury, and I didn't catch the title of the other one. Do you mind repeating that?
So Netherford Hall is the one that's been out on submission with my agent. Yeah. So Netherford Hall I wrote at the beginning of 2021, and then Queen of Fury I wrote right after that. So yeah, and so Queen of Fury will be out this spring, so in March.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you had written one nonfiction book. And that, I guess, is Geek Mom Projects, Tips, and Adventures for Moms and Their 21st Century Families. What led you to write that book?
So for quite a few years, I was on the editorial team over at Geek Mom, which was an extension of Geek Dad, which briefly was part of the Wired family of things. So I did work as a blogger. I got to travel and do all kinds of fun things in the parenting blogger world. And we got a book deal. And so we were able to write that book. So I had 3 other co-authors as part of that program. But unfortunately, as many books happen, as we now know by watching all of the Penguin Random House information go on, they forgot to do marketing for us. I met with them and they mentioned that they thought that Wired was going to do the marketing for us. So we didn't really have a marketing plan. We didn't get any mainstream reviews for the book at all. I don't know who dropped, like, I don't know at this point, it's just like, I remember telling them, like, my book, Pilgrim of the Sky, my little small press book, got covered in Library Journal, in book lists and all these places. Like, why was this book not there? And it was hard to come back because that was very much, I did like a media tour. I got to go to New York City. I was on all these local TV stations. I did like a gift guide at the holidays. I mean, it was like the full 9 yards, but it just tanked. And I think it was a wonderful book. It was just a shame. And we're hearing this all the time, right? That sometimes there's just not the gas behind a thing. And, but I will say I am working on another nonfiction book proposal right now. And what is good is that I do have that experience already. So I kind of had a full circle moment this week as I was working on that proposal and saying, I can go open up my old proposal and take a look at that and have that experience. And I don't feel scared to do it. And what's nice about nonfiction proposals, you don't have to write the whole book. You actually just have to do parts of it. So I have a lot more confidence in being able to do that. And I'm looking forward to being able to kind of put my own stamp on nonfiction. I'm very passionate about doing nonfiction work as well. And certainly within the fashion world, I have a lot to talk about. So yeah, I mean, that was kind of, that whole thing in a nutshell. It was an interesting time, but that was part of what led to that first burnout. But we learn, we live and learn.
Yeah. Well, we'll swing back around to fashion in a minute, but before we go there, you've earned a reputation and some prominence as an advocate for mental health care. Please tell us a little bit about your work in that area.
Wow. So, for better or for worse, that really happened with our own family struggles, with one of my children in particular, and just the abysmal state of support, lack of support that exists, and education. When we were seeking diagnosis, we did get their diagnosis when they were about 6 years old, and but it was one of those situations very much like with my ADHD diagnosis of like, but they're so smart, but I don't, we don't understand. They're so smart. Why would they have this diagnosis? But there just are not, there are supports and there are schools and there are programs for certain kinds of people with certain kinds of mental illnesses. But even then, there are not that many. And when it comes to children who have tendencies for self-harm, who have tendencies for disruption, who have, severe levels of mood dysregulation, there just isn't anything. And it does not matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter, who your doctor is. It doesn't matter what. There just isn't anything. And we have fought for years to get better oversight. We were finally able to get some government support. The only reason that we have that is because we had so many emergency room trips that finally they were like, yeah, we probably should give you something. So our child has what's called the Innovations Waiver in North Carolina, which is basically like winning the lottery, except you never really see the money. So because of the challenges of the last few years, there aren't enough staff. So even though he qualifies for all kinds of staff supports, we don't get them. There's nobody who wants to do that because they're not paying them enough. But it's just not it's not a job world that people really want to run into, especially when my child is very, very tall and strong, right? But there's just a huge dearth of staff. There just aren't enough people. So we're trying different things. We at least he does have medical coverage for a long time now, so he doesn't have to worry about, medicine coverage and things like that. So he's got kind of a Medicaid rider, which is great. But we're primary caregivers. Like we have virtual therapy sessions every week, and that's pretty much it. We're about to start with a new psychiatrist, which we're very excited about, but that has taken 2 years to get together. And the only reason is because we actually qualified for one of their programs, and after talking to me, they're like, yeah, I don't think this is a good fit for him. I said, no, it's not, because he's too smart for things like ABA therapy. Like he's gonna think it's annoying. He's that kind of smart kid. But it's terrifying because, we recognize our privilege that, we could have exhausted our 401ks and sent him to some spa camp somewhere. We have put him in wilderness therapy. It doesn't matter, though. It doesn't matter. It kind of levels the playing field when in our many visits to the emergency room. There are kids that come in and out of there like train stations. The hospital is the only place that these kids can go. And the facilities that are there, the schools that are there, it's at their discretion. Had a wonderful school that he went to for a while, and at a point, the schools can just kind of say, this isn't a good fit anymore. So, and we tried to get him into other programs across the country, and since if any private school, which they all are, none of them are public, they can say, oh, the medication situation is too complicated, or we don't feel like we have the right staff for this. So everyone's looking for the well-behaved special needs kids who are not going to cause problems. And so it is really up to parents and to the schools. And, we learn, we become experts, we tried our best, and that's what we can do. So, the hospital waits, that's how I got on the doctor's television show, which was bizarre, but we waited over 220 hours in the emergency room for a mental health bed in 2017. And I mean, just that in North Carolina is, I think, 48th in the country for mental health for adolescents, in spite of the fact that people come from around the world to train here to teach and learn how to serve adolescent children. We actually live in a mental health desert. So the people here don't actually have access. You have to know people. Like, the way we found his psychiatrist was through his pediatrician happened to have gone to medical school with this person and pulled a favor. But like that, again, an average family is not going to know that. And my husband and I we're trying to move to a new program where we can hire staff instead of getting a staffing agency. And we're barely able to do this. And we're we're smart people who work at big important companies, and this feels like it's too much. And it feels like the system is made so that you don't get help. And the most recent time we had an emergency, I talked to a woman. She said, well, just so you know, when he's 18, there's some fantastic group programs and group homes. And I said, are you kidding me? You're just hoping to wait until he's somebody else's problem. So, that's how it is. That's how it is.
Yeah.
And I don't see that changing, unfortunately, especially in our state right now. There's not a lot of priority we can put on that at all. There have been some improvements. I will say UNC has made some big improvements. I hope some of them came as direct results to some of my complaints after we had some very bad experiences. Kids now who are in mental health crisis are not generally put in the general overflow area. They do have better triaging programs to get them into better, more comfortable areas, but it's still so far from perfect. We just, yeah.
Yeah, that has to be frustrating.
It is. And it's one of those things, like, occasionally my husband and I will all just kind of like look at each other and be like, we don't know what normal is. We just don't. Occasionally I'll talk to someone, they're like, our kids are just so overscheduled. It's like, it's water polo and then pottery, and then we're doing flower arrangements. And I'm just like, you're blessed. I don't think people realize we could never get our child into extracurriculars because he just couldn't deal with competition. He couldn't deal, like, these are things that, in autism, it's very difficult to deal with. And, just people don't realize how lucky they are to just have these overscheduled lives, to have busy experiences. But, we have grown closer as a result of this. But it is not easy. And the caregiver burden, especially over the last few years, has been immense. And many families, we're far from the only ones, are really kind of at our wits' end with what to do, because we're not trained for this. We're doing the best that we can. I tell my son this all the time. I love you, and I hope that my love is enough to pull this through, but I am not a trained therapist or clinician. I am just trying to do my best, and I'm going to mess up, and I'm really sorry, but I'm going to try to make it better, and I'm going to try to love you through it, because that's the best that I can do.
Well, you've shared extensively on social media and really pretty candidly in this conversation about your own adult diagnosis as ADHD. Why is it important to you to share this?
Well, I I grew up always knowing that I was different, but I didn't have any kind of word or language for it. I was actually talking to my mom about this today. My mom discovered my TikTok, which is a fun conversation in and of itself. But I was telling her, I said, one of the reasons that I think it took me so long to get a diagnosis, among many things, is that my parents gave my sister and I such a rich, full of arts upbringing. So I'm a super artistic person. I paint, I play music, I write, I dance, like our childhood, I could ping pong from hyperfocus to hyperfocus before I knew what those things were. And I always struggled with social relationships, but I didn't feel like I missed out on it because I could just go home and paint a super detailed Yoda picture for 4 hours, and that was fine. And it was great. My parents thought it was super cool, and they're going to get me more paints. And, even we didn't have a lot of money, but they always made art a priority. My mom's a painter. My dad's a musician. His parents were English majors. So our whole family just had this beautiful artistic embrace way, which I think, that's what so much psychology is showing us, that like child-led learning, especially among the neurodivergent, is incredibly healing, because schools do not really give us the world. It's not really built for us. But I've always been very learning driven. So I didn't struggle academically in school except for math, which I'm pretty sure I have dyscalculia, because I just really I still count on my fingers, but I have a master's degree. And I always really every other subject, no problem at all, but math, just so difficult. But I was in gifted classes, so I did my first fashion program. Got to do that there. But I think it was really the difficult times that we came across, but also going through my son's diagnosis and seeing, because he has many diagnoses, and ADHD is part of that, and seeing those patterns and really recognizing that in myself. And one of the quotes, and I forget who said this, but many, and maybe not the wonderful article about the lost generation of women, that so many of us get by for decades on self-loathing and adrenaline, because that's what drives you when you don't have dopamine, right? You have deficient dopamine, you're going from thing to thing. But when the world stopped, I wasn't traveling, I didn't have events to go to, I was in the same day over and over and over again. And it was hell. It was hell for me and my brain. And I was like, something is wrong with me. Something, for the first time in my life, I just really, really knew that things were not adding up. And that's when I found a good psychologist, and we went through the testing. And in the middle of all the restrictions, I went in and took this official, computer test where they measure your eye movement and your body movement and all these tests and everything. And I remember going over them with her, and she's like, "You are textbook ADHD." She's like this, your results are what you would expect to see in a book that shows you what to look at. And it was like, it really was that I was either really good at things or really terrible at things. And it was just this like huge break. But of course, there's a lot of other things that go into just besides the test. But and then of course the big test is they try you out on stimulants. And if you have a dopamine deficiency, stimulants do not make you excitable. They actually focus you and calm you down. And it was like, I remember the first day that I took a stimulant, pouring myself a cup of coffee, and it was like all I was doing was pouring a cup of coffee. And I was like, my whole world was just this cup of coffee. And normally there's an oompa band in my brain going off in 3,000 different directions, which can be great. It can be fun, but not all of the time. Right. And unfortunately, when you go for a long time with ADHD and you're fighting against all of this, and you do create, there are comorbidities. So I have panic disorder, I have depression, I have anxiety. They're not unconnected. I was talking to my mom about it again today. We were talking about our shared weird panic issues that we have. We both have a sleep panic disorder, which is so fun, that as we're falling asleep, we wake up in a panic attack. That's just a thing that we both inherited. Don't know why, just not fun, because I like to fall asleep and I don't like to wake up. It's like a severe hypnic twitch, right? Most people just kind of twitch, but both of us will wake up like heart racing, sweating, like a tiger's running into the room. So, I felt so alone for so long. And when I finally started learning about ADHD, it was like, I'm not alone. I'm not just weird. I felt so ashamed for, being disorganized. And man, when I was in college, I feel so bad for my roommates. Like I was just such a mess, but I have clutter blindness. I have a really hard time when things are messy. I don't see the mess, I see through it. I have time blindness. If I don't have a schedule in front of me, I'm a mess, but I hate schedules. So, I'm constantly like having to work on that, but I also have a tendency to run into burnout. And that's something that a lot of women in the corporate world struggle with as well, because the corporate world pushes you to be an overperformer. And when you can get into that hyper focus and you perform really well at work, you have a short fuse. I might be able to do something in 2 hours that might take someone 6 hours to do. But if I'm doing that day after day, week after week, year after year, it's not sustainable, right? So I hope that I can be a cautionary tale, but also hope that I can give people the education to talk to their doctors, to get medication if that's what they need, to get therapy if that's what they need, because there's no point in being ashamed or beating yourself up. It's not you. You're not personally at fault for these struggles. There's nothing wrong with you. I had that too. I've never had a lot of friendships. I've had one or two great friends and lots of acquaintances. Like I'm a friendly person, but I also need to be alone, and I love being alone, and I married my best friend in the world. So I kind of feel like I'm good. I don't like super complex group dynamics. Make me really, really anxious. And I remember being, as young as, fourth or fifth grade and being like, I can't keep track of who we're supposed to be mad at this week. It's just the drama of it is just exhausting to me. I'd rather go read a book, where if I'm stressed, I can put it down and go read another book. I don't want to deal with that stuff. And, I have my best friend in the whole world lives a town over, and, we go walking in the woods together, and I don't need a whole squad. I've got wonderful writer friends, and I've got all these things, and I've got a couple of wonderful, super close soul friends, and that's what I do, and that's, you know, that's okay. I don't need the, like, you know, bridal party Cancun getaways that the media tells us these milestones that you need to have as a female presenting person or whatever. It's just it's important to know that your brand of who you are and how your brain is fine. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing. Even the concept of being neurodivergent is a little, to me, it's a little deceiving, because we're just different pattern brains, you know. Nothing wrong. I mean, look at so many writers and creatives in the world. You can't tell me that we're just wired different, and that's okay.
Yeah. Well, on a less serious note, you post popular series about fashion history on Twitter and longer essays on your website. What led you to start doing this?
So I talked a little bit about Netherford Hall, which was my Regency Witch book that I'm hoping will find a home soon. But that was what started Thread Talk. I was writing a scene about chintz, and I have loved fashion and historical fashion forever and ever and ever. When I was in the gifted program, as I mentioned, I did a whole retrospective on fashion of the 10s, 20s, and 30s, as most third graders do. And I kind of took to Twitter talking about the history of chintz, because it's so fascinating. Still to this day, one of my favorite topics to talk about, because people think of chintz, they think of, you know, my grandmother's tuffet or ottoman. They don't realize how much history and imperialism and colonialism and complexities go back to this simple pattern. And it just sort of took off, and I started doing them more frequently. I think initially I wanted to call it a thread, but then I thought, well, Thread Talk kind of sounds like TED Talk, and I like that. So Thread Talk is what it became. And I used to do them every week. I do them every month now, because every week is a little too much for me to maintain, because I'm such a research nut and I have to do so much research on them to get them done. But that just grew my followers and introduced me to so many phenomenal people. And it's another one of those great examples of, you know, I was told for so long, you know, Natania, no one wants to listen to the stuff that you come up with. You know, you always have to go too far in your research, and, you know, no one's interested in these details but you. But you know what? It turns out there are like hundreds of thousands of people that are interested in this stuff, because truly nobody really is educated about the history of fashion. And in fact, even in the academic world, fashion had a really bad reputation as being frivolous, right? And a lot of that has to do with misogyny. A lot of that has to do with toxic masculinity. We don't want to show these men peacocks, right? We don't want to show that men used to wear flowers and lace and things like that. And it's really only been in the last, 20 or 30 years that there's been this real resurgence, and partially because the materials are falling apart, right? This is like, what I love about fashion history is it's so ephemeral, right? We only have these things for a little while. They don't last forever. And it's been so rewarding. And it's something that there's no end of opportunity for, and it really brings a whole, I mean, it's like two sentences in the book, right? Viola gets a chintz dress and wears it, and we talk about the pattern, and that's about it. But it happened to have spawned a whole bit, and it was really the thread I did on muslin, which of course is this sort of really quintessential Regency fabric that even I didn't know had this heartbreaking history, because we're not taught. We're taught that muslin is this beautiful, pure fabric that all the beautiful, English Regency women wore. We have no idea that it was at the cost of millions and millions of lives, and the destruction of an entire region, and the absolute pillaging of an entire culture and the landscape and the environment. And it has like repercussions that are still today over these materials. We don't have, the industrialization of garments has just within 100 years completely eradicated this concept from our minds. So I love, I feel like it's my duty to try to have people think about this, because we will lose that. And it was something that was so important for human beings for thousands of years. And it really is the heart of human culture. So much of it goes back to the dyes that were used, the fixatives that were used, the materials that were harvested, who was harvesting it. And then, of course, all the way to who was wearing it and who was allowed to wear it, and how they were allowed to wear it. And, it really is such an incredible story. And I'm hoping to make it as accessible as possible to people, because what's being written is still wonderful. And I love the academic stuff, but I'm really reading it. It's like the dialectical, overview of the so-and-so. I'm like, okay, I get this, but is an average Twitter person going to get it? Probably not. So let's talk about this in a way that is accessible to most people. And that's really important.
Yeah. So you have essays, among others, on your Thread Talk of the costumes on the Bridgerton TV show, the Netflix Sandman show, and the Amazon Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. And those are all very different. So should we infer from that you have a wide range of things you like, or a wide range of things you're curious about, or a mixture of the three?
It's really the first. I love all three of those things, and they are three things that are massively influenced on me. Bridgerton came out just as I was finishing Netherford Hall, and I was so excited because the characters looked like they do in my book, because I wanted to write Netherford Hall to be a more diverse book as well, so that, like, this idea that people had different backgrounds and skin tones, and so I was so excited, and I love the show. I think that the liberties they take are beautiful. I think we get too stodgy about keeping everything perfect. I don't love the corsets. I don't love the zippers, but overall, I love modernizing the look and making it sort of this pageant style version of it. I love how campy it is, and I love how romantic it is. I just think it's so cool as this show, and it's making people talk about fashion, which is always an important thing, right? For Sandman, it was the first comics that I ever read that were kind of graphic novels versus, like, I read Ninja Turtle comic books and I read Spider-Man comic books, but this was like the graphic novels, and reading Sandman just like blew my mind. So I just could not wait for that show to come, and I knew that I was going to be just, drooling over the costumes, and did not disappoint whatsoever. And Rings of Power, I mean, my husband and I met because of The Lord of the Rings. Before it was even a movie series, we were on a text-based role-playing game. So I know some people don't feel that the new show is as lore whatever as it could be. I could just watch the costumes all day long. That's my next Thread Talk, which will be this week, actually. I'm just going to go through the full costume now that the series is finally done for the year. But I think it was so beautifully done. It's a first season. Of course, there's things that could be done better, but I loved going back to Middle Earth. I will always be a Hobbit at heart, and I read very widely. I love all kinds of media. Love superhero shows. I try to focus the Thread Talks on things that have, for the most part, some historical connection. Sandman was a little bit of a deviation, mostly just because I just love Gwendolyn Christie. I had to talk about satin, which is a future Thread Talk. I'm still researching because satin is such a big topic, but I just the historical elements they pulled into her costumes as Lucifer, and then kind of there were so many good interviews with the costumers, and it's rare that a show has that, unfortunately. But I also did one on The Witcher as well, and it's just so much fun to have this. We have a glut of fantasy and science fiction shows these days that have phenomenal production value, and I can talk about these things, and I can kind of weigh in and be like, they used velvet here, that's really interesting. The velvet would be, and what's kind of fun is that I've amassed so many Thread Talks now that I can kind of refer back to them. So it's like, okay, well, if you want to know more about this, you can read this Thread Talk, because I talk about this color or this dye or this method here. So yeah, and if I don't particularly enjoy a show too much, in some cases I could just kind of focus on the things. But I generally don't talk about a show if I don't like it. My best approach is just to focus on the ones that I do like. And if I don't talk about it, I just don't talk about it.
Well, you said the medieval period is your home in history. Do you have a home in fashion history specifically?
I do, very specifically. The 1880s. The 1880s are my fashion home. I will pick out a dress from a whole lineup, and it will be from 1885 or 1887 or 1883. The peak of Worth, the House of Worth, of the House of Paquin, that period of time, sort of right as they were, sewing machines were becoming more available, sort of more complex machine created lace and overlays, but also sort of that period where the bustle was no longer ridiculous. You kind of got away from the super big bells of the previous period, but also not the sort of later bustles that you kind of had were just kind of a little silly. But also just the fun of that period. There's so much play with asymmetry. There's so much color because you've got this heyday of aniline dyes, which are just so vivid and bright. And the competition happening between the fashion houses. I would love to write sort of a magical realism story about Paris at that time, sort of battling fashion houses. I think it would be just the coolest thing to write. And just the kinds of, it starts to be more accessible for people to have access to more fashion. And so you see the envelope constantly being pushed toward this more fantastical. And it's before the Gigo sleeves kind of overtake everything in the 1890s, which I don't mind too much, but it gets a little bit ridiculous for me. But yeah, I just love the 1880s. As someone whose heart will always also live in Westerns, there's something just so beautiful too about that period of women coming out of the stagecoaches in these gorgeous gowns from New York and Paris onto these dusty streets, and that sort of contrast is so romantic with their perfectly buttoned boots and the hats and kind of looking up over at the horizon. I think I will always love that.
Well, is there anything that you would like to talk about that we have not touched on tonight?
Well, I think we're going to talk about what's next, so I can talk a little bit about Queen of Fury. So
that'd be great, because my next question is actually what's next for you. So that's awesome. A perfect lead-in. Yeah.
So the Gods of Londinium we talked about is out December 1st, and that is the big romance. It's a male romance. Mostly that will be out from Falstaff Books, but Queen of Fury is the follow-up to Queen of None, and it takes place a few years after the first book. It is a dual first-person point of view, and it features Huifar, who is Guinevere's older sister, who you meet in the first book, who is a libertine, a drunk, a drug addict, a sex addict, who has a lot going on in her life. She makes some very bold appearances in the first book and was a favorite character among quite a few readers. So they were quite excited to hear that she had the showing in the second book. She is called back to Avilion, because her father, King Leodegrance, is falling very ill. Her sister is currently queen and cannot come over to help. And she very reluctantly has to go to the Isle and sort of confront a lot of the very complicated pieces of her past that have kind of turned her into the person that she's become, and face the ever-growing chasm inside of her, because turns out you can have all the fun in the world that you want, but it doesn't actually solve your problems, which she already knows. She's very smart. She just, keeps hoping that maybe if she just hooks up with one more person, then maybe that time will make it better. Very reluctantly, she has to ask Arthur for help, because it turns out that while her father is sick, her father's half-brother tries to pull a coup on the island. And so because they've sent so many of their own soldiers to Caerleon to fight, they don't have enough knights anymore. And she promises Arthur that she will marry one of the knights that he sends over if he sends over some knights to help them. some of the knights that come over include Sir Gawain of Orkney and his brother Gareth, as well as my personal favorite, Sir Palomides, and Sir Lanval, as well as Sir Bors. So you get a little bit more of the whole bigger picture of who these folks are. You get their view of Avilion, which is kind of falling apart, like a little bit of a play on the Fisher King. There's a blight on the orchards. Things are not going well. And Gawain kind of falls for her, and it's a challenge because she clearly doesn't feel the same way. She's got a lot of other things going on, but he can't. And Gawain's story is quite different. Their arcs kind of have this very interesting back and forth, because he's sent on Arthur's behalf because his body's giving out. You know, he's only 28, but he's been fighting since he was 15. He's got ruined knees. He's got a ruined shoulder. He's got scars everywhere. He's huge. He's like 6'7". He's a big man, so there's a lot of pressure on all his body. And they don't, even though there's magic in this world, you can't heal everything. So he's in enough pain that he knows he's no longer good as a warrior. And his real struggle is, you know, who is he if he's not the Skull Crusher, right? That's been what he does. That's been what he's been good at. What was kind of really fun for me to play with is, you know, Anna in the first book sees people a very specific way. She's not always a reliable narrator. She lives a very narrow existence in a very specific way. And you get to see Gawain in a totally different light, because you see events from the first book and understand things he was going through. He has some pretty terrible scenes in the first book, but you understand what he was going through in context, because he comes across very different from the very beginning of the book. And you're kind of like, this isn't the guy that I thought this was before. But he's really learned, and I wanted to also show that he's very much his mother's son, and she has taught him well, and he is sensitive to Queefar's plight, that he understands, like, all she has to barter away at this point is she's too old to be married, but she's doing it anyway. It's all she's got left, because even though she doesn't want to be where she is, she cares enough about the island to put herself in that position. And she doesn't expect a knight to have any compassion or any understanding of it whatsoever. And that definitely throws her off. But then it's very much after that point becomes more of the kind of adventure in the woods that so many of the other Arthurian stories are, which is what was so much more fun about it. So, you know, Anna's story is very much a sort of, you know, a jewel box story, right? She's kind of in the castle. She leaves like once, but most of the story is really within the confines of Caroline. There's multiple castles. I play on the Castle of Maidens. You learn about Lyonesse, you learn about Ys, you learn about Broceliande, the forest, that's the magic forest. We find Yvain and his lion. So there's a lot more of the sort of Chrétien de Troyes kind of feeling of the story, where the little adventures are kind of happening from place to place, and there's a lot of romance. It's a spicy book. So there's more of those kinds of scenes. But it's really, at its heart, it's about power, privilege, and love. And it's about the connection between these two characters, and both of them explicitly being told you can't get together, and them figuring out what that's going to mean for them. And part of it's about toxic masculinity and male fragility, but also understanding, again, kind of in the surrounds of that world, what you can and can't do, and Gawain's place as Arthur's nephew, and his loyalty to someone he loves versus the loyalty to his liege lord. So the tagline is in Arthur's court, love is treason, because you're only supposed to love who the king allows you to love. And what happens when you love someone, especially someone that the king already jilted once. So it's really a character story. It's really something that just, surprised me. I never anticipated that Gawain was going to be a main point of view character, but within 2 or 3 chapters, he was just there. So it was really neat to be able to write both of these characters from these perspectives and have these scenes kind of happen throughout the story, and then have so many more characters from the whole Arthurian canon kind of come in and out. Anna has a few really important cameos. You kind of learn what she's been up to since she kind of finished her first story. And
well, let me ask you a question about Anna, and I'll try to do it in a way that's not a spoiler.
Sure.
For those of us who were very pleased with the last scene of Queen of None, will we be pleased with where that goes, or are you going to spin that?
You will be pleased. So she has her happy ending. But she continues to grow beyond that in terms of her own abilities. So let's put it that way. So she gets a bit of a squad. So you'll see that. So I really wanted to make sure that was sort of continued to build, because kind of similarly to talking about Rock Revival, right? Rock Revival about a band that's falling apart. I mean, that's to me one of the cool things about the Arthurian stories as well, right? It's a kingdom falling apart. There's nothing you can tell in the story that everyone knows it's not going to end well for Arthur. So you're setting this up for things to fall apart. But that's the way the story has been told in one way. And right. So I'm hoping, I do have a third book that I would like to do. This book sets the scene. So the Grail appears in this book, as well as the Green Knight. So those are some of the things that set the scene for the final book. And the final book is called Queen of Mercy. And it is about the Grail quest and the Grail Maiden, and the child that is the child of Arthur and Morgan, who in my story is a young woman. So the first, I guess Huifar is also a character that I created, but a truly completely created character on my half, who is eventually will be fostered. It's not a spoiler, but will be fostered by some of the characters in this book. So fingers crossed at some point get to finish that one. But this was just such a wonderful, important love story for me to write, and it was wonderful. I had a wonderful reader who really helped get through. It was still challenging. It's a big book, and it's one of those books that, as you know, as a writer yourself, sometimes you get through the book and you kind of go, wow, I am now a different person, and I understand the world a little differently, and I don't know where these people came from exactly. Gowan in particular really surprised me. I knew Huifar so well. She just kind of leapt off the page in the first book, and had this queenly presence, and I knew I was going to show her vulnerability and kind of get through her stuff. I was not expecting that Gowan would have such softness to him, and you find out early in the story, and this is not a spoiler, but he was really close with Gwen. No spoilers, but that relationship really shapes him, and they're both shaped by what happens in the first book so much that helps bring them together, and you can see someone who chooses to be a better person. And I think that's a really good message too. I think so often we feel like we are the way that we're built, but we can choose to be better people. And Gowan makes a lot of stupid decisions because that's still who he is. He's still going to do the thing that you tell him not to do. But I got to name the sword, I got to use Galantine, and I got to have Gringolet and all those fun pieces of Gowan lore. And that was just so much fun, because that was where it's my home, and weave all those things in. So I'm hoping you'll find the same kind of thing where I kind of tried to take the stories as we know them and just show them from a different corner of the room.
And so that'll be out in the spring?
That'll be out in March. Yep.
Great. Well, where can people find information about your work?
So the best place to find me most days is on Twitter at Natania Barron, but nataniabarron.com is where I keep things updated in terms of larger announcements. You can find my TikTok at Natania Books on TikTok, and that is the bulk of where I am most of these days.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this. This has been a great fun for me.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been delightful.
It has been a real pleasure for me as well. And thank you to everyone who has joined us, and we'll see you again on ConTinual.